Welcome everyone to another edition of Play It Through, and on this edition it's Kid Kool and the Quest for the 7 Wonder Herbs, brought to us by Vic Tokai. This game and its subsequent spiritual successors have a weird history. This game alone was originally released as a game featuring a child actor that was popular in the 1980s in Japan, Kenji Sagara. We'll get a little bit more into it as we get farther in, but here we go with Kid Kool and the 7 Wonder Herbs for the NES. This game is an action platformer, very slippery controls, and it takes a lot, and I mean a lot, to get used to it if you ever are able to adapt to the way that this game kind of works. There's also a handful of annoying features throughout the game that don't really add to the enjoyment. The biggest one being that the game is all centered around speed as you try to save the king before they pass away from their illness. The game starts off with a fairly lengthy little cutscene before we get to the main menu. After the cutscene, we finally get to the main menu where we can begin our adventure. Classic Mario-style lives screen before we jump into the first stage. As Kid Kool, it's one-hit death, but if you have the fuzzy, which also works as your weapon, it does work as an extra hit point. However, if you throw the fuzzy away from you and then get hit, it still counts as if you didn't have the fuzzy with you. You'll notice immediately that the game has a sense of speed to it, and the momentum of your jumps is greatly affected by how quickly you're moving on the ground before attempting to make the jumps, as well as how long you hold down the jump button. The game is broken up into 7 worlds with 3 levels each. The third level of each world is a boss encounter at the end. The bosses are relatively easy in comparison to just the overall difficulty of the platforming throughout the rest of the game. One of the biggest mechanics you'll have to get used to in the game and use it quite often is the skipping over the water using your butt. When you have a bunch of momentum running over the water, you'll skip a bit based on how fast you're running, and you can jump during this. You'll only bounce a handful of times before eventually your momentum will stop and you will sink into the water and lose a life. If you time it correctly though, you can make it across pretty long bodies of water in the game. The biggest annoying factor, though, by far in this title for me is just the fact of the screens being the multiple layers so that it kind of does that transitional scrolling between that stops everything. We can actually use this to our advantage, and we will a little bit later on in the game in order to actually get rid of some enemies. However, for the most part, it's more of a nuisance than a help throughout. One of my favorite things in this game is those large poles that you're able to grab onto and then fling yourself. Based on how quickly you run into it and where you run into it, you'll be flung farther and faster, and you can really get across a large area in the game using this. Now, the biggest thing I haven't talked about yet is the way that you get the game's various endings. The whole game is a giant speed run. You need to beat the game in under an hour and a half. So you see that clock in the upper left corner, that's always slowly ticking up. You gotta make sure that it doesn't reach an hour and a half. If it reaches over 3 hours, though, the king ends up dying when you finally make it there, so not really much of an ending once you finally suffer through the whole thing to get there. Most of the bosses in this game involve these plungers that you have to slowly get down in order to defeat the boss. The first one is exceptionally easy, to stand on top of the plunger and then jump every time you push it down. As long as you jump when it does get pushed down, you'll land on top of the enemy, then just wait for him to move, and you'll fall on top of it. This is a repeated strategy that we're going to use over and over again throughout the game. The only thing that really changes up is the two different styles of bosses. One's where the plunger moves on you, so you got to keep hitting it as it moves across the screen. Still easy once you get the timing down. The last type is a giant robot that you have to bring its giraffe-like neck downwards by consistently jumping or staying on top of it. Once again, not too difficult, but you have to be careful with your timing on certain jumps so that the boss doesn't run into you. Along with the annoying screen scroll, there's also plenty of other really big nuisances throughout this title. One is one that we see in a bunch of games, and that is invisible blocks. There's a lot of hidden things in the air, so you'll find yourself jumping and bashing your head, causing yourself to then fall down, hopefully not into an empty pit below where you lose a life, but it most likely will still cause you to have plenty of headaches when attempting jumps. Before doing really anything, test out the air before you make those jumps. A lot of times you can alleviate a potential death just by making one jump and then setting up your big one. The other big problem is these air pushers. They are constantly throwing air your way, pushing you. They have pretty much the same pattern all the time. It's a very weird pattern that takes a bit to get used to as far as that little break that they finally give you where you're able to continue on. A lot of times you have to just hit that sweet spot with your own jumps and movement to just get through using that little break that you end up getting from those air things. And they are all throughout the entire length of this game, so get used to them early. If you collect the money bags throughout the course of the level, you will get the bonus game here, which is a big roulette wheel, and you'll be able to stop it on random spots. If you get the fuzzy little guy that you get to use as your weapon, you get another chance, another spin. If you get the icon that's you get an extra life, and if you get anything else, it's no good, and you lose that chance. And you have to do this every level, and it's honestly really tough to time it and actually get it down to get extra lives consistently, so I usually just try to avoid it to just save myself some time. One of the other items to keep an eye out for is the 1 minute up and 1 minute down. Of course, 1 minute up you don't want to grab because that will end up increasing your time by a minute, but the 1 minute down you want to grab every time you see it because it does decrease that timer in the upper left corner down a full minute. Here's a spot where I end up bouncing on an enemy multiple times, and because of this we have to sit through the screen scroll so many times before we're finally able to get on. This game slows down to a halt on a very consistent basis, and this a lot of times gives me an opportunity to calibrate where I'm about to go or what I'm about to do next. Like I mentioned, the endings of the game are based on the amount of time it takes you to complete the game, with 3 hours, 2.5, 2 hours, and an hour and a half being the thresholds for deciding the various endings. You're going to see the best ending when we get to it at the end of this run, but the other endings include it, like I mentioned, the king dying for the worst one, but then the other endings involve you getting money as a reward, getting some land and a reward, getting some money and becoming the king's son, and finally getting money and getting the princess as your bride. A lot of me getting better with Kid Kool was taking my time. In a game that's all about speed, you think you really can't, but the game does give you ample amount of time to complete the game within the hour-and-a-half time limit for that best ending. The thing is, though, it's going to take you many attempts to get good enough at the game, probably, to see it through, and many may get frustrated just trying to run through it straight, and losing plenty of lives along the way, but then getting that bad ending would be very discouraging, and probably would discourage me as well as a kid, saying that, yep, I beat it, it's good enough. But you honestly have plenty of time to take your time. Moving at those right moments. A lot of times, like I said, this wind is going to be exceptionally annoying and will keep frustrating you from the first moment to the last. But persistence and patience is a lot of the key to get through Kid Kool. Staying on the upper level gives you a good advantage as well. Longer jumps, you have less of a threat as you'll come crashing down, at least having to go through another screen before you end up having to either lose a life or potentially fall into the abyss below. For this boss, it's the first of the giant robots. Like I said, you gotta jump on its head. It'll keep moving back and forth, bouncing off the left and right walls as it jumps. Since you have the platforms in this area as well, it's pretty easy to stay on top of its head. In fact, you can just keep walking on its head over and over again, in order to keep hitting it and doing damage. The game does have a couple of secrets. Well, one fun exploit. Bouncing on the top of those swinging poles, you can actually bounce on them multiple times, getting extra lives. Once you do it enough, you can lose a life and do it again, or to keep earning extra lives up to 255. It's a very similar trick to using the turtle shell in Super Mario Bros., the game that infinite amount of lives, basically. Another cool secret is at the end of 5-3, there's a hidden trophy that you can find that will end up alleviating 1 hour of your gameplay, or 1 day of your time. So if you're really struggling with the time, just be sure to grab that when you're in the 5th world. The third world being inside this cave-like area reminds me of Super Mario Bros., the Underground, or the castle levels. There's just so many NES games that try to mimic that style. Another one is Mystery Quest that comes to mind, a game that I was basically haunted by as a kid till I was finally able to conquer it as one of my earlier playthroughs. There's a lot of winding kind of paths throughout this level, bouncing along these springs and eventually making our way to the end here. Like I mentioned, this game and its subsequent follow-ups have a bit of a weird kind of release. After Kid Kool, or the game based on Kenji Sagara in Japan, they came out with Psycho Fox for the Sega Master System. The game is very similar, but more refined in its gameplay, though it can still be frustrating at times for sure. Interestingly enough, in the Brazilian territory, the game was released as Sapo Zul. I know I'm completely saying that wrong, but basically Zul Frog, a Brazilian comic frog character. Then for the Sega Mega Drive, or Sega Genesis, there was a game based off of the Magical Hat property in Japan, but that game was then changed into the one we know as the Cap Attack for the Sega Genesis, which happens to be one of my favorite Genesis titles. So a weird kind of release pattern for sure, with multiple licenses being used in different territories and different systems, but not quite as convoluted as the Crazy Castle series by any means, but still interesting nonetheless. Be very careful at the beginning of 3-3, the kind of running jumps that you'll need to do with the water can be pretty tricky, especially also with a little bit of that wind pushing you downwards. Just do your best to make as much momentum as possible before attempting certain jumps. Here I'm going to wait on the edge a moment, wait for my fuzzy to return before I throw that guy out in order to take out a couple of enemies and then continue on. A lot of these little segments here you can just run across. That little gap is able to just easily be traversed. You may sometimes be pushed down into the openings via the air being pushed on top of you, which is annoying. Just keep persevering, wait for that opening, and you'll finally be able to sneak through. Sometimes it takes 10-20 seconds to actually be able to do it. Here we can take out a couple more enemies before then making a big run across the water and a leap so that we make it safely over the other side where we face off against the next boss. This one's identical pretty much to the first world boss, so just keep jumping on its head, falling off of it to hit the plunger, doing so repeatedly to take out the boss with no problems. World 4 is a desert-themed world, and the big gimmick here is these platforms that then collapse. So you have these stairs that will collapse, and then you'll have to kind of slowly slide your way up, forcing yourself to run uphill, which of course is going to be a tad more difficult. A lot of times during these, they will also have cannonballs rolling down on you, which can be annoying and a little bit tricky sometimes to jump over, but honestly, they're not as bad as you think they would be in a game that doesn't have the greatest control. though thankfully I find this level a little bit easier than what we just dealt with at the end of World 3. Right here you can use the screen to kind of help you out so you can see where the enemies are, and you can actually keep jumping to get them to slowly fall off the edge, and if they go off screen they do disappear and won't return, or if you have the fuzzy enemy you can easily use that to help you take them out before trying to go up their stairs or the slope. The last little part of this level is pretty straightforward, just a handful of enemies that are going to try to stop you, but not too much before reaching the end. 4-2, the second of the desert theme levels, is pretty much more of the same. A lot of the slopes, we're going to hit one of these giant poles to swing us, and it actually does drop us down into a level below. Be careful right over here of the jumping enemy. The hitbox on that weird rope-like jumping enemy snake thing is pretty lenient. It's just kind of like the eyeball that ends up hurting you, but still be careful of those guys. Here you can go up top or just run straight through the middle. If you grab this pole, you can swing yourself up to the top portion here, running across, and that way you can at least get past that little bit of water that was below. Make sure you do a running leap out of this opening so that you can make it across the gap. You may accidentally clip the blocks above and fall straight down. If that happens, be prepared to jump immediately so any cannonball about to be fired out doesn't accidentally run straight into you. Kool gives you a lot of cheap hits and deaths all scattered throughout. A lot of learning it is just seeing those problem spots, knowing where they're going to be in levels, and then taking your time accordingly so that you don't end up losing your Kool while playing Kool. The last part of this level has a bunch of enemies falling from the sky, so be very careful you don't rush this very end part. Take your time, and then you get a 1 minute down from the background and the end sign. Right as we begin 4-3, we're going to drop on down through the opening. I like throwing the fuzzy guy because you kind of get stuck and frozen in midair as you scroll through the screen. Just another one of those humorous things due to the mechanics and the way that this game is programmed. There are some hang gliding enemies in this level. They'll fly overhead and drop down on you, so some of them can get in your way. Now right here, when you're going up this slope very slowly, eventually you'll be able to get onto the platform. Wait for the cannonball, then make your jump off of the first enemy, and hopefully that'll help you get on top of that hill before the next cannonball comes out. Be careful on this spot here. As soon as you make that transition, that cannonball is going to fire out, so we're going to jump on over that first cannonball fire and then try to get over the rest of the enemies. We are nearing the end here, just a few more kind of jumps that we need to do. There's another minute down, though, before we reach the final kind of jumps and the boss encounter. This is another one of those ones where we're pushing the plunger down, so get it on screen and get the boss to appear. It'll start moving. Basically, we're going to do the same thing we've been doing before. Just keep on jumping on it, and every time you land, make another jump if the enemy or boss is anywhere near you. When it gets a bit lower and you're close to the left wall, it's a bit more difficult to land on it, so stand on top of the boss's head and wait for it to jump out of the way, and then you'll fall off of it onto the plunger. Make sure that when you do that, though, you're as far onto the left side of the monster when this happens, so that when the monster makes its next jump, you're able to get into the air before it runs into you. That's really the only occasion I run into where that boss ends up hurting me, or any boss similar, is if I don't make that kind of final jumps and we're too close together on the far left or right side, it can sometimes jump into me. World 5 is the sky-themed world, and this gives the game an excuse to have a lot of really broken up platforms, and making them all white disguises every single one as a cloud. There's even broken bridges consistently throughout, and there's a lot of these really small, just single sets of cloud platforms, and a lot of times I do recommend staying as high up as possible. There's no water or lava for you to fall in during a lot of this, so instead you just have big open pits that are marked with the yellow and black striped bars. So if you see that, do not fall down there. It's not an opening, it's a death. Five, 2 continues the trend. We're going to go along the bottom here, but be very careful on all these little individual blocks. It really isn't too difficult to get enough momentum for short jumps in Kid Kool, even with the weird wonky momentum that the game has, honestly. Doing these short jumps is not actually too bad. Just make sure with any enemy that you land just directly on top of them. With the wind being pushed down on you, just quickly run across any of those kind of little things and hope that you don't get pushed down. But if you're moving at a pretty good speed, you should be able to run straight across. At any spot like this where you have a series of individual blocks and there may be an enemy, just take out that one enemy and then go to the beginning and make a running leap. With the single gap spots, of course, you can just run straight across. This spot can be a little bit troublesome. I recommend staying above if possible, so use the air push to get on top of them and then just go across that way. Right after that, there is a bunch of enemies falling from the sky, followed by a falling bridge. Mostly just a few leaps as we're nearing the end of the stage here, once again taking out an individual enemy before running across, and if you make a leap, the air should push you right above the other one so you don't get pushed into the pit, and you're right at the end sign. 5-3 has a few of those giant swing poles that you'll be able to use, including one at the end of the level that if you time it right and hit the upper right corner, you'll find a hidden object that gets rid of an hour off of your time. But yeah, really time it on that final one. All throughout this level, there's a lot of just little individual jumps that we're going to make, being very careful of the large open area below that will, of course, be an instant death. If you do make any kind of giant swings, try to come down straight so you land on safely on a platform. Most of the time, there's at least one piece of a platform nearby anytime you make one of those leaps of faith throughout the course of this one. We're right at the end here, jumping and landing right here on this pole. We don't quite have enough momentum, but this is the one that you would hit to get in that corner to hit it with your head. But either way, we land, and it's time for the next boss. This one's pretty much identical to what we just dealt with in the previous one with the plunger moving. It's just the dinosaur-looking guy instead of the fuzzball-looking guy. Just be very careful when the plunger is getting lower, that there's enough distance between you and the boss that when you land and have to jump again, he doesn't jump into you. Just 2 worlds left here in Kid Kool, and this one introduces a fun element that's in both this and the last world, and that's the pipe system. Some of these pipes aren't really that effective, but for the most part they actually are pretty useful. You can ride them and get across certain areas, but there's plenty of areas where the gap is really narrow, so you'll have to use the pipe. While they may be a bit slower than just running on past, they're usually a lot safer. And even though they are slower, they aren't going to take away that much time from your overall speed run. Trust me, there's going to be a lot more issues with dying and having to restart levels than there will be from using the pipes. The beginning of 6-2 is pretty difficult. We're going to need to do a running, skip, and then a big jump over the first set of water. We're going to use the spring to get us across the first pipe, but if you want to, you can take the few pipes that are scattered throughout the beginning of this area. But the big concern is, once again, another big running skip but jump that we're going to need to do to get over safely to this area where we'll then take the pipes. Thankfully, the pipe doesn't shoot you down like it does the cannonball straight down into the water, or else that'd be pretty devious of a trick there. Here we're going to make another big running butt skip. Just make sure that you don't jump too early, or the wind things above may push you down into the water, causing a death. The level is not particularly long, but that's mostly because there's just so many tricky jumps with the butt skip that you have to do. And it continues right away in the next level with us doing another one, but this time with a few springs. It's pretty tricky, but be careful, even with the wind above, that you get into this little opening. You can bounce across and over to the right for another pipe to go across. Be careful at this spot here. We're going to use the spring on the right side to go up. There's enemies right above on the platform, so just kind of go to the left just slightly, use that spring, and you can get above on top of that area and then run across safely without having to deal with any of those enemies. Here we're going to run across and just drop down here. This is a little bit of an easier area, even with this annoying air pushing thing right at the beginning. For some reason, there's a glitch sometimes, I don't know why, but the screen will kind of go orange, the background will, but grabbing an item or anything will reset it back to the normal color. I'm not sure exactly what happens to cause this, but now right here, I immediately get hit by the cannonball from above and lose the fuzzy guy. This was the best run I had ever had where I got the World 6 without being hit prior, without losing a life by an accidental hit or mistiming one of the skip jumps. I consistently was having runs where I'd get late in the game and World 6 would be my undoing. So I don't blame anybody for getting frustrated once they made it to this world. Thankfully, the boss, though, is relatively easy to take care of. It's an identical fight that we've done, this time with the red fuzzy guy and the plunger that moves to the left. Just be careful, again, that you're in the air and above him when he makes his jumps towards you, and when the plunger is close to the wall, that you're extra careful about it. But once he's taken care of, we're moving on to the 7th and final world of Kid Kool. The final themed world here is this dark or night-themed world. The pipes make a return from World 6, so we're going to use them to our advantage whenever possible. Some of the enemies here can be a bit difficult. The fly jumping guys and avoiding them in some areas will be a tad difficult throughout World 7. The screen scroll here can be a bit annoying as we're trying to get up, being careful of the cannonball that's going to fire directly at us. A new element added to World 7 are these platforms here to have the electricity kind of running around them. Obviously, you'll want to avoid that. The slopes and such with them allow you to get a decent amount of momentum as you come off of them and can make some decent jumps. Be careful here of the cannonball firing out. Make the leap over the cannon if you can. When you land down here, be careful. I unfortunately landed a little short of where I wanted to and ended up getting hit by that cannon, so I gotta be extra cautious throughout the rest here. Be very careful again when jumping up to a platform like this with the cannonball about to come out, and don't really try to ascend until you know it's going to be safe to go over the cannonball. The bouncing fly guy will also make his way there, so a lot of times I'll just wait safely until all the enemies pass. Right after that, these electric lines, you have the electricity kind of going across the thing. You're able to walk across, make sure that you avoid that electricity. Also a bit of an annoying factor with a few things above your head during those, and then trying to get up to this platform up here with a bunch more. One thing with the fly enemies, when they first appear on screen, they immediately start a jump. So if you're running full speed, a lot of times you'll be able to easily run underneath of those flies as they're making that first jump on screen. As soon as 7-2 begins, we're going to run to the left and then make a running little skip jump across the water. Thankfully it's not far, but still an annoyance to start off any level like that. Watch out for the cannonball on the next platform. Go to the right and jump up to this one, running underneath a few of the fly enemies. Now here, I'm going to wait underneath of here, trying to make sure that the electricity doesn't run into me, and let the couple of enemies above bypass before I then jump up the platforms and get up here. Well, it's safer to make the next couple of little jumps here easier if you're on the top part, going from that last platform, but unfortunately I slipped to the bottom a little early. There's a handful of these electric lines in a row. Watch out for the bug guy here. You'll make a big leap here, and you can land on the far right safely before getting back up to the top level. From here, take out the enemy, and then you'll do a running skip jump. And that way you can land right into this little pipe and bypass a couple of enemies. Once you land safely here, do a running jump over to the left so that you can get to the top platform. Just kind of be careful here when you drop it down. I almost ended up missing and falling into the water, just barely catching the white pole there. Right after that, 3 of these enemies are going to make their way down these steps. If I make a running leap, I can get to the top and get over the cannon before it fires out. If you're not comfortable making that, just wait for the enemies to bypass you and then attempt to go over the cannon. Take the top cloud platforms. You can run across a bunch of them here at the end, getting in between these 2 little platforms. Just be careful when you drop out of there that you don't go too far to the right because you will land in water. There's a little jump over the water. You can do a skip, whichever one you prefer. Then be very careful because right after that is a lining of spikes with one of those electric lines above it that we'll need to use in order to get across into the end sign. It's time for the final level of the game, 7-3, and this one is of course going to be a big pain. We're going to start off by dropping down. There's a handful of springs. Kind of got to get used to landing on these springs safely, but if you're able to, kind of steady yourself and then start working your way across over here. Use the spring on the end to kind of get right over the electricity and make it to the next set. There's all these little individual platforms as we're making it to the right. You want to be very careful of the center spring. Sometimes if the electricity is making its way around and you hit that spring at the wrong moment, you'll bump your head right into that electricity. Take out this enemy here and then jump over to the right. You can take the pipe if you want, but it's just a short little journey. Be careful here of the bug enemy as well as the cannonball. I usually wait for a cannonball to bypass and the bug to get a little down before I attempt to jump over. After a few hang gliding enemies, be cautious of them as they kind of dive bomb you during this segment. Use the springs to kind of get above any of the little hazards right there like that water trap. Right after that, be very careful, wait for these bugs to kind of make their way down, and if you use your momentum, you can make a big jump to the right over the cannon. Now for this segment, just to make things easier since I don't have the fuzzy, I'm going to use the screen to manipulate these enemies. Just jumping up and getting the screen to consistently scroll, they get closer and closer each time. Just be sure that you're not too far to the right that they land on you, but as long as they don't, you'll be able to safely get past once they both get off screen. We are nearing the end though. Be very careful in this segment here with the springs. If you hit any of them, just make sure that you're holding right so that when it bounces you down that you land directly on top of one of the platforms right below. Use this spring here to get up safely to the platform. The wind's going to keep pushing you, but just kind of keep fighting against it like you have the entire game. But thankfully, we're at the very end here. Just one last jump over this pit, and it's time for the boss, which is a rematch against the robot guy that we have to bring down his neck. Now, what we need to do here is to jump on top of him like we did before, and just kind of keep moving back and forth, jumping occasionally if we need to. Just be cautious sometimes, of course, when his neck gets a little bit lower, he may accidentally run into you, but overall, for a final boss, not too challenging. There's one last little trap to try to get you, a line of spikes leading to the end sign, but just try to get past that, do a big jump to reach the end, and depending upon your time, you get to enjoy whichever ending you've earned in Kid Kool and the Legend of the Seven Wonder Herbs. So there you have it, the best ending to Kid Kool and the 7 Wonder Herbs for the NES. This is a title that I've been working on for several years off and on, but just the last few months I've really been trying to finally get this one complete and check it off my long list of NES games that I still need to do videos for. It's a weird platformer for sure, and not necessarily one of my favorites by any means, but Kid Kool, I think, gets kind of a negative reputation, but honestly, while it has its flaws, isn't the worst that the NES has to offer as far as bad platformers go. As the credits finish up, we then get the end screen with Vic Tokai Presents as our final little screen here. And with that, it's going to wrap up this episode of Play It Through. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.